Now, back to existentialism and the way in which it approaches things and the way existentialists approach things. That's the better formulation. You could say that in a way, if we try to think of existentialism as a way of approaching things, existentialism is ancient. We could also, so we should distinguish between existentialism as an approach towards the big questions and existentialism as a movement in, let's say, the 19th and 20th century.
Yeah.
So we have two distinct notions here: existentialism as an attitude towards questions and existence and being, and existentialism as a movement.
Mm-hmm.
What is particularly interesting to point out is that there are all sorts of attitudes towards a subject, and it is good to start by the attitude that existentialists do not embrace, so we understand things by how they contrast. So think of someone who engages in philosophical thinking and treats philosophy just as a mental puzzle, just like a sort of mental gym. I need to do something. I want to think about something. I want to solve a crossroad puzzle. I think of a philosophical problem. I take all the assumptions that generate it, and I try to see which assumption is wrong. And if I cannot move this way, I start to say that, well, if I reject assumption A, I'm led to position X. If I reject assumption B, I'm led to position Y. And I see all the positions that get generated from that. Let me give you an example, because this is too abstract. You could say that someone contemplates on the question of whether there is a God, and he doesn't really care about whether this is true or not. It's not something that is important for him. He could say, well, these are the arguments for God. Some of them have to do with the 5 ways of Aquinas. The other is the Anselm's ontological argument. If you have these assumptions, you're led to the conclusion that there is a God. And you examine the arguments as arguments without caring about the issue. And on the other hand, you contrast them, or that person contrasts these arguments with atheistic arguments, or arguments from different schools, such as, pantheism, panentheism, schools like that. But at the end of the day, he treats this as a mental puzzle, as a mental gym. This person may read a lot on these subjects, may write papers, may write books, but he doesn't care. This person may become a professor of philosophy even. He can walk into a classroom, he can start saying, well, these are arguments for and against God. And you could see that this person does not ultimately care. Do you think that this is philosophical, or there is something lacking there?
Heidegger would say there's something lacking there.
Yeah. What would you say? I would agree with Heidegger on this point.
Well, it's lacking a holistic component. It's all for the sake of it. Philosophy for the sake of philosophy. That could be seen as inauthentic in some ways, I think.
There is zero caring for it.
Yeah.
Or there is very little caring.
Yeah.
It is, you could say, a waste of potential. You could actually see how these questions are impactful for our lives. You could actually see how philosophy matters and how it affects our self-conception. And ultimately, there's zero of that.
Yeah.
Whereas someone like an existentialist who would follow Heidegger, for instance, in saying that care is the fundamental aspect of human beings, would deeply care about these issues. There would be a sort of burning passion to give answers or to come up with one's answers. And this is also what we see with is relevant to the distinction between thinking that disinterested thought is the fundamental aspect of human beings, which I don't think Descartes did think that. He was anything but disinterested.
What do you think he thought?
let's leave
Okay.
Descartes for another time,
enough,
but he was not disinterested.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
And what Heidegger says about care, we could say, instead of it being an either or, we could say that there's a question of degrees.
Mm.
And the question of the degree in which you care about your topic and the passion you have makes it a sort of burning question for you. That the first person we talked about, the professor I talked about, has no passion for it. It just sees this as a mental exercise, or has a passion which is not a sort of existentialist passion. It does not affect his self-conception and his identity. He doesn't care. Whereas in the other case, if he did care, he could be saying, we could say that he approaches his subject as an existentialist, He deeply cares whether there is a God or not. He deeply cares whether there is an afterlife or not. He deeply cares whether we are free or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this ties with the recent discussions on philosophy as a way of life. There's a question as to what sort of life is the philosophical life and what is the non-philosophical life. So what would you say constitutes a philosophical life, if you can try to answer? And this links with authenticity.
Sure.
What would be involved in a philosophical life?
It would be the existential life. You're aware that, depending on, I suppose, if you're an atheist, you have faith or whatever. I think what we need to say about existentialism is it arose in this period of time in the Industrial Revolution where science was basically taking over everything.
Yep.
Not slagging off science, just neutral value judgment. You also had, as Nietzsche put it, the death of God. So there was this sort of existential angst and anxiety that was taking over society, and people were wondering, why are we here? What's the meaning of life? And that's where existentialism comes from. So if you're asking yourself existential questions, of which authenticity is a key concern, what is the authentic life? That would be the philosophical way of living, as opposed to just going along life, no real sort of awareness of your contingency in the world and plodding along with your head in the clouds, basically.
So not everyone agrees with what is involved in philosophy as a way of life, of course. Whenever there is a question and philosophers come up with different answers, some of them just for the sake of it, as we indicated. But I think that you're correct, because you could say that we can use philosophy to improve our lives, and we can live what Socrates said that is the examined life, when we reflect about things we care about deeply. And it is very hard to think of human beings who have never cared about these issues. Some of them don't. But it is hard to think that deep down, if we really think about it, we don't care. Yeah. So you may think that what I said now is in conflict with the scenario presented you before, because you could say, hey, Stelios, if you say that human beings care for these issues on the one hand, but you gave me the example of someone else who doesn't care, I think that this is an apparent contradiction, because the question is how conscious someone is of caring about things.
Sure, yeah.
And that is a major theme in existentialism, that we care about things, but we cover this, that we are frequently unaware that we care about things, because we are immersed in a world where habit takes over, and most of the things that we do in life, we do habitually.
Sure.
And our care flies under the radar of custom and habit.
It's to do with degrees of consciousness.
Yeah.
I see it as basically, in my personal view, the unphilosophical life would be pure materialism and consumerism, which is a facet of modernity. singularly, and then at the extreme other end, the philosophical way of life is more of a sort of mystical, transcendental orientation towards the world. We can go into that a bit later when we get to Heidegger.
I think that this is a great topic to discuss right now that can function as a really good bridge to authenticity.
Yeah.
So you're talking about materialism and the materialistic life and the more mystical life. What is the materialistic life? Let's flesh this out, because we frequently talk about people who live like materialists, and we frequently talk about materialistic values.
Yeah.
Let us flesh this out a bit, because it's important to say, what do we mean when we talk about materialism?
Yeah. So you got philosophical materialism, which is the view that basically reality is made of atoms primarily, and that's it.
Yep.
Materialism as an ethical system would be you're primarily concerned about material stability and wealth, and I suppose
quantitative stuff.
Ratio.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it might.
Okay.
But
let's leave that for another time,
sure.
With the ratio, because I think that this is linked with the reason, and very frequently reason is something that at least rationalists would say cannot be explained by matter. I think it cannot be explained by matter.
Sure.
And I wouldn't say that reason and materialism go well together. But
I'm not trying to. I'm not trying to conflate the two.
Let's go back to materialism. So we have ontological materialism. That says that deep down, what things are is material. That matter is the fundamental thing out of which things are composed. And the question is, that doesn't say much. What do we mean by matter? Because if you define that's a trick. If you define matter as that which things are composed about, in that sense, you can be simultaneously a materialist and an idealist. Sure. Because you could say the fundamental thing that things are composed of, i.e., in other words, matter is ideas or spirits.
Yeah.
So the materialist goes one step further. It is not just the person who says that matter is deep down what things are composed of. The materialist is bringing a very specific conception of what things are composed of. And you have people like Democritus who would say that deep down we have that's a 17th century word, but deep down we have atoms, and atoms are those bits that cannot be divided.
Yeah.
And in the 17th century, and maybe a bit before, there is an idea of corpuscularianism, and that matter is composed of tiny corpuscles, as that's how they called it. And so that's ontological materialism. But we frequently talk about materialism in a social context, and we mean something different, because not every materialist in the ontological sense believes that there are no values. There's a deep philosophical question as to how they can sustain this view, but let's say that not every materialist in the ontological sense espoused what we call materialism in a pejorative sense in the social sphere. So what are the materialistic values? You said prosperity, wealth, consumerism. And when we talk about people who live in a materialistic sense, do we mean that they're also hedonists?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
They could be primarily concerned with material security for their family.
Yeah.
They could be primarily concerned with material security so they can fly to Dubai every weekend and have a party.
Okay.
It's
there's a difference there.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
So when it comes to matter, sorry, can you remind me the question you did before? You asked
I said there's a difference between ontological materialism and
okay, we talked about things that fly under the radar. Okay, yeah. So the question is whether we do live in societies where many people live like materialists.
Yes.
But there's a question whether they actually value this stuff. In a sense, they do. But wouldn't you say that there are every now and then some moments, some, flickerings of consciousness? Is that a correct way to put it? Yeah, where there are some flashes where something like a conscience tells people, well, no, that you're not really in favor of that.
Yeah.
You don't really value that. So let me give an example. Let's think of some, let's say, young people. Okay, let's say early 20s, who are really hedonistic and don't care about the future. They don't think about their future, and they are just waiting to seize every opportunity to go out in clubs and parties and get wasted. Wouldn't you say that so in a sense they act as if they do value that? But the question arises: do they actually value it, or do they do it habitually because other people do it? So when you see someone smoking in early 20s, is this person smoking because he genuinely wants to smoke, or because he was in the past under the social pressure to smoke to prove himself worthy, to be admitted to the group or the team?
This is the question of authenticity.
Yes.
Some people will be inauthentic in doing those things. Others will be authentic. It's difficult it's still the individual, right?
Yeah.
And that's the existential question.
And this comes with a distinction between what is frequently called a distinction between the authentic self and the inauthentic self. That is a sort of new vocabulary to portray the distinction between the real self or the deep self and the low empirical self. You have this theme virtually everywhere. Very few people would disagree with that. I think most empiricists do. I don't think Berkeley would agree with it. Yeah, so let's put it this way: most empiricists would disagree with it. But let's go back to our example. We have people who engage in activities, and they give the impression that these activities represents their true values. But the question arises: are these their actual values? Values that, if they pose to think, they would embrace? Or are they blindingly conforming to behaviors that they see other people also conforming to? Never posing the question to them, is that what I really am for? Is that what I really value?
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.